Welcome to the North Texas Church of Freethought. Of course, it's September 13th, and we're going to talk very briefly about the truth. Of course, we could go on at very great length about that subject, but we're going to be brief today. Truth is something that pretty much everybody thinks they know and understand, and of course, everybody thinks they highly prize it, and they put that value over everything. And I think it's a future topic as to whether or not, as the Jay Nicholson character says in one of these movies, whether we can handle the truth, right? But that's another topic. Today we'll just talk straight out about the truth. But as far as what it is and how much I understand it, when the most intelligent of our ancestors and people living today even have tried to define it, to say just what it is or even to describe it, they have difficulties. The problem falls under the philosophical category of epistemology, from the Greek word episteme, meaning knowledge. So the NTCOF is a church. It's not a church, it's a real church. We're not just making a statement, although we are making a statement. We're a church based on the idea of religion reinvented as a, and I'll ask people to mute themselves so we don't get interruptions. We want you to be able to sneeze, but not interrupt as we're presenting here. Anyways, we're trying to reinvent religion as something sensible instead of something absurd. But we're not a philosophy study group either. We often talk about philosophy. It's very hard not to talk about philosophy because philosophy has to do with every aspect of the human condition, as well as with making sense of and conducting our everyday lives. Anyone who does not recognize this has just not been thinking enough. So in the West, philosophy and religion have tended to be separate, whereas in Eastern religious traditions, they've tended to be intermingled, or perhaps a better way to think of it, never really separated. When the Europeans first encountered Buddhism, for example, they puzzled for whether it was philosophy or religion. If you put on Google, search, is Buddhism philosophy or religion, you get 23 million hits. Yet the Bible and even the New Testament undeniably contains bits and pieces of philosophy. It is well known that the influential early Christian Augustine of Hippo, as well as Clement and Origen before him, famously brought Platonic philosophy into Christianity, and Thomas Aquinas later in the 13th century brought Aristotle's philosophy into the mix. It would be an interesting research project to try to figure out how and why philosophy and religion came to be seen as so separate West, but not so much in the East. I suspect it had something to do with the rigidity of commitment to and the control over people's minds of supernaturalism, and the deadening effect intensified by the formation of the veneration of Scripture. In the East, they have lots of different scriptures, and I don't believe there's any single one of them that they say, this is the Word of God. It may also be that the distinction between religion and philosophy allowed a freer development of secular philosophy and science, so maybe it turned out to be a good thing in the West. Here's perhaps one reason for the religion-philosophy distinction in the West. One wonders how many heretics who were murdered by church authorities would be regarded today as philosophers. Certainly Giordano Bruno may have been one of those. One might also wonder whether the ideological descendants of this attitude that's shown on the screen here, this quote from Colossians, whether that can be found today in creationism and other forms of anti-intellectualism, and even in time of a global pandemic, denial of the germ theory of disease. And oh yes, that's out there. But consider this passage from the Gospel of John. Certainly a John gospel is the most sophisticated of the gospels compared to the others called the synoptics, because they see things together, synoptics. Remember, John begins by referring to the Greek philosophical idea of the logos, equating it to Jesus. Well, that's straight out of Platonic philosophy. Now, I've not had time and opportunity to thoroughly consider what Christians make of this passage, but I have seen that it's often considered as Pilate mocking Jesus, where Pilate, if you've read the quote here, Jesus is being interrogated during his trial in the Gospel of John, and Jesus says, To this end I was born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. And Pilate responded, what is truth? And then he says he went out again to the Jews. So this is portrayed, what I found by most Christian people on that anyways, as mocking Jesus, of being dismissive of the truth, and even ridiculing the idea of the truth because it cannot compare to, obviously, Pilate's life and death power over Jesus and other people. But I think if this exchange actually happened, that it may have reflected Pilate's being an educated man. He was aware of the dialogues of Plato. After all, they were hundreds of years old already. Pilate might have been aware of the Socratic method of questioning. John suggests that Pilate did not wait for an answer. It's just too bad that the account does not go into it. It would be interesting if we could compare the reasoning of Jesus to that of Socrates. What would Jesus have said of what is the truth? How we can know of the truth? No help there. What a shame. And as we saw with the Colossians verse, it's actually Christians who mock, dismiss, and denigrate the serious questions that philosophy then and since has addressed. So what have philosophers had to say about what truth is, or how we can know truth, and what is acceptable to believe as truth? Well, to begin with, there is this idea that truth should correspond with experience, with what anyone can perceive or observe firsthand. That seems very intuitive. So, for example, your screen now shows a blue box with the word correspondence in yellow capital letters. If I now tell you that I look outside and I see kind of a gray overcast sky where I am, that corresponds also, except now you have to rely on my saying so as being the truth. The first is what the 20th century British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell called knowledge by acquaintance. You're directly acquainted with it. The second, which depends on someone else's say-so, or what we read in books, or otherwise come by second and third hand, he called knowledge by description. At every step away from our direct personal experience, we have a growing potential for believing something that's not the truth. And goodness knows humans can believe lots of things that aren't so. And indeed, we may be the only living thing that can have false beliefs. So we need something else besides correspondence, or it would be useful to have something else besides correspondence. And although Russell sharply criticized and rejected it, this idea of coherence or coherentism. This is the idea that truth can also be things that stick with or are consistent with a body of knowledge. And perhaps the best illustration of coherentism is that a belief may cohere with established facts by perhaps being the logical consequence of our thinking about those facts. I could tell you that if you went and stuck a fork in an electrical outlet, you're going to get a shock. But that's not the truth, because what if the power just went out, so you didn't get a shock? And then you'd say, well, see, I can safely do that. Maybe not. But scientific progress depends on this idea of coherence, in as much as fruitful, quote unquote, theories suggest that further observation or experiment will have an expected result. This is something the creationists miss, is that their ideas about the Genesis story being completely factually true, fruitful, does not suggest any lines of inquiry, any way to further observation and experiment. If the expected result, of course, of something that you expect is not found, then something is wrong with how you tried to make sense of things, and that's very helpful. So then we come to knowledge as justified true belief. But there are problems with both these criteria, justification and with deciding what's true, because that's what we started with, right? And then what justifies the thing that you're using to justify something with? And where does that end? You have an infinite regress of what justifies what. And how can you possibly know that something is true when the standard is some idealized theoretical endpoint of all inquiry, some final or absolute truth? Because you're never going to know that. We suspect or hope that we're getting clear all the time, but can't know what that endpoint is. Of course, problems do not mean giving up. It's still a good thing to have in mind what we are after, even if it is foolish to suppose that we can or will ever get there. Like the speed of light or absolute zero, There are ideas that are important and useful without our being able to fully realize them. They point the way, and that is more than sufficient. And we'll come back to this idea of truth being a pointing to the way in a minute. Finally, American philosopher Edmund L. Gettier threw a monkey wrench into the idea of knowledge as justified true belief in a 1963 article in which he constructed examples where someone is justified in believing something and happen to be right, but for the reasons they supposed. So someone could look at a pasture and see a shape that leads them to believe that it is a cow, for example. But what they saw, let's say, is not actually a cow, or maybe it was a cardboard cut out of a cow or something else, maybe just a patch of black and white. So they're wrong about that being a cow. And behind a tree or some other object that's also in the pasture, there is in fact a cow. So did the person know that there was a cow in the pasture or not? Subject of debate. Bigger than all the problems is that so much easier to be wrong than to be right. Simple because there are so many more ways of being wrong than of being right, because it's like entropy, right? I mean, be wrong a zillion different ways, but there's only one right thing. In fact, it is entropy because the truth is a kind of order and organization. It certainly does take energy to achieve it and maintain it. And that's very applicable to our everyday lives. We're always struggling to maintain order, and sometimes it can be exhausting. And the corollary of this is that there's no way of knowing with certainty when we're right, but we can know to some degree when we're wrong. Falsification can be mistaken, of course, but it doesn't happen very often. Einstein initially inserted a cosmological constant in his theory of general relativity. When the universe was found to be expanding, he abandoned this idea, calling it his greatest blunder. And yet the cosmological constant has reappeared in the form of dark energy. It's an active subject of investigation and debate. This is a wonderful quote from Isaac Asimov, that the most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, it's not "Eureka, I found it," it's "That funny? Why did this happen?" Suspecting when wrong is also how we learn, not just in science, but in everything. The problem is that in everyday life, very often people don't want to learn something. For the new to be threatening or disappointing. And truth be told, it is true in science. When scientists say that's funny, they usually try to figure out what mistake they made that gave them the unexpected result. They had better too, because others will find their mistakes if they don't. But things like the cosmic background radiation, for example, they were found in this very way. Once all possible mistakes and extraneous factors have been accounted for, Penzias and the other guy, I forget his name, had to conclude that there was this very continuing, basically static, coming from all directions in the universe. Of course, we call that today the cosmic background radiation. Another wrinkle is that there are all kinds of truth. This is not to say, as postmodernists say, that there is no truth or that anything and everything can be the truth. Asked how history would remember World War I, for example, the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau famously said, "One thing they will not say is that Belgium invaded Germany." Still, it may be that for you, vanilla tastes better than chocolate, and the opposite is true for others. Some are cat people, and others are dog people, and so on. And as the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, the architect of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, pointed out, the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. And this too, because language is ambiguous, and where more than very simple things are involved, susceptible to a variety of interpretations. And that little fact is well known to politicians and theologians. That is really virtually their stock in trade. They can say one thing and mean the opposite, and they can justify it afterwards, trust me. You see it every day. Sometimes the truth of a matter, as I said earlier, has to be carefully looked for. Sometimes we miss it, and sometimes we need to come back to it again and again, as do with most subjects we discuss. Truth can be like the layers of an onion, the center of which we never quite get to. We must always be looking for what is being pointed to and how and why and what is doing the pointing. And this is from the Holy Scripture of the Surangama, where the Buddha said, if you point at the moon, and someone looks at your finger, taking it to be the moon, not only do they not see the moon, but they're mistaken also about your finger. So look at what the truth is pointing to, not just what it seems to say. And of course, there's so much more. But consider this. It's an image of a penguin, of course. But now consider this. Do the first four words change the meaning? Do they add in any way to the first statement that this is an image of a penguin? There are those who say that it's possible to simply never use the words true and truth. And it's often been said at our services that whereas belief and especially faith are taken to be necessary and sufficient for religion and for living our lives, it's not really necessary to believe anything at all. We can rely entirely on what we know by acquaintance, what we've seen, heard, smelled, tasted, touched, and what we've been told, read, thought about, and so on. We don't have to incorporate all these things into our brain and say, this is our belief. So, what do you think? Here are a few things that are interesting about September 13th today. In 1814, the British failed to capture Baltimore, and that was the night that Francis Scott Key was aboard a ship in the bay and wrote the defense Fort McHenry, later set to music as the Star-Spangled Banner. Very interesting in 1848, and I think this is important to freethinkers because it set us on the road to understanding how the brain and the mind are related. That's the day that a Vermont railroad worker, Phineas Gage, survived a tamping iron 1.25 inches in diameter and 3 foot 7 inches long being driven through his brain. The physician that showed up on the site described the guy still talking, conscious, getting nauseated and throwing up, and as he described it, a half teacup full of amount of material, brain material, falling out of his brain onto the ground. And yet this guy survived, lived another 12 years, but his personality was changed. Yeah, isn't that something? Personality was changed, and people that knew him beforehand said the old Phineas Gage was not there anymore, proving really quite dramatically the link between your brain and your mind of what you actually are. There's no supernatural soul driving the car. Famous case, Phineas Gage. Imagine what that was like for him. In 1962, this is the day that a federal court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, who was the first student of African ancestry who was admitted to that segregated university. It's not like the court made the order and he went right in. No, the legislature passed a law saying that the university was not to admit anybody who had committed certain crimes, and then they immediately charged the guy with a Trump crime. So it just shows the kind of struggle that we've gone through to try to achieve some kind of rational and sensible and fair treatment of people just based on something as stupid as the melanin content of their skin, which we know does not make you a different race, and we've talked about that before. But such is the silliness of people and their persistence in believing false things, which of course is partly the subject of today's presentation. So here are our principles as freethinkers. We want to learn and live by the rule of reason. And it's not like you can just recite a catechism and have it down. You can't just say the Allah Muslim creed and you're a Muslim. You have to work at being a freethinker. It's fighting against the entropy of stupidity and ignorance. And then, of course, enjoyment. And it's important because we need to stop and realize that we're here to enjoy and appreciate our lives. What we have, not what we don't have, and holding our happiness hostage to what we don't have. And finally, of course, finding value, meaning, purpose, because that's what it is. You don't just love a chocolate shake. You may love how it tastes. You love the experience. You put value and purpose on that. But love is at the basis of everything that we do. So just a reminder, if we talk about politics, let's keep it academic and dispassionate. Talk about policies and not this or that politician is a jerk and an idiot. Respecting others, and if you think you're going to say something that could be offensive, to just say, like they do in Congress, you know, the honorable gentleman. I say, Merlin, I fully respect you, love you a lot. Your opinion about this, I have to disagree with. That's disagreeing without being disagreeable, in other words. Let's not be antagonistic if this subject comes up. And a reminder that what we do is not without cost. And of course, we don't have the hotel costs anymore, but hopefully we will in the near future as this pandemic winds down, we hope. Visit and donate at our church website. We depend on your continued support. There are reasons to get money, but they all boil down to one reason, that we can do together what none of us can do on our own. Plus, you'll be darned to heck if you don't. You'll be spring forever in heck. So help us promote your values. Tell your friends about these get-togethers and give them the URL or our YouTube website, and demonstrate your commitment and be the future you wish to see. You don't need to come up with there we go, making America great since 1930. What happened in 1930?
I was born.
We all need to get one of those, Merlin.
I have friends that sent me a birthday present, and one of them was a hat with "Good since 1930" on it. And then they sent me this mug.